Okay, so just stopped halfway up Rough Crag just for a bit of a breather, because I've got a lovely aspect of Haweswater. That's probably a good half of it there. The other half of it hides around the corner, and then right the way down to the end here, the southern end of the reservoir. And I say reservoir because it wasn't always a reservoir, because pre-1940 this valley would have looked very different. So back then there was no reservoir. There was two small lakes called high water and low water, separated by a raised tongue of land called Meesand, where there was a little hamlet, and then stood proudly at the head of the valley down at this end was the village of Mardale Green. Now, unfortunately, circumstances conspired against poor Mardale Green, because after the First World War there was a need to expand urban infrastructure throughout northwest England, coupled with a state of chronic unemployment. And at the time, Manchester was a growing city that needed water, and so its eyes cast further afield and eventually landed on this valley. And eventually, after much opposition, an Act of Parliament was drawn up in 1919, which gave the Manchester Corporation permission to flood the entire valley and create a reservoir to essentially feed growing Manchester. Work eventually started 10 years later in 1929, but then stopped a year later for 5 years due to the Great Depression. But eventually, in 1940, the dam wall was finished and essentially plugged the north end of this valley. And then over the following 12 months, the water levels rose and the valley was flooded, consuming the villages of Meesand and Mardale Green, and essentially turning what was two small natural lakes into one huge reservoir, which is the Haweswater that we see today. So all of the residents had to be evacuated and rehomed. In the little church at Mardale, 97 bodies had to be exhumed from the graveyard and relocated to neighbouring churches. The residents' buildings were all used for explosive practice by the Royal Engineers, and it was only the little church that survived obliteration. Its stone was used to build the reservoir takeoff tower, which you can just see on the east side, the east bank of the reservoir down there. The loss of Mardale was particularly lamented by Alfred Wainwright, who wrote, "Gone forever are the quiet wooded bays and shingly shores that nature had fashioned so sweetly in the Haweswater of old. How aggressively ugly is the tide mark of the new Haweswater." So you can imagine back in Wainwright's day, it probably did look like a scar on the landscape, but in the subsequent decades it's naturalised fairly well. So this jut of land down here called the Rig is artificial. There's also a little island just beyond there which you can't see from here, and that's artificial, planted up with those pine trees that were fashionable at the time. So they tried to naturalise it as well as possible. In fact, looking at it now, apart from the low water exposing the sort of tide around the edge, it does look fairly naturalised. The pine tree stands all the way around the shores are the only bit really which looks somewhat artificial. So the current Haweswater Reservoir there is now 4 miles long, half a mile wide, 200 feet deep, and it has a capacity of about 84 billion litres of water, which is enough to give everybody on the planet a bath. And these days the only evidence of the old Mardale Green village are when the remnants of its old walls and roads become visible and emerge in ghostly fashion during major droughts, the last ones of which were 1984 and 1995, and they emerged just down here where the old village used to be. And it's amazing to think that the Haweswater Reservoir supplies water for Manchester, which is about 50 to 60 miles south of here, and it travels along from the takeoff tower straight underneath all these areas of high ground, and then follows a huge water main down to Manchester, vaguely along the course of the M6. Apparently it's big enough that you can stand in and walk along, and of course it was built at the same time as the reservoir, so is, you know, almost 100 years old. And so that's the sad tale of Mardale, sacrificed for progress and population growth. If you want to learn more about the history of Mardale, which is really fascinating, then I'll put some links in the video description. There's a website called Mardale Jewel in the Crown or something like that, which has some really brilliant historic pictures, some of which I'll have no doubt slipped into the video today when I'm editing it. But yeah, that's well worth a visit, and if I find anything else of any interest, I'll pop that on the website as well, in the description, rather the video description. Right, nearly back at the car, so until next time, signing off.